So welcome to, as we try to revise the biology 2025 question paper. So very important that you take note, especially if you're writing your exams there. So according to to this question there, it actually says number one, the liver cell in the diagram are shown as they would appear under a microscope. So if you notice, this is a liver cell. Animal cells do not actually have a cell. Then it says how many cell walls are visible. There's nothing because animal cells do not have a cell wall. Remember they said it's a liver cell, so that is what you needed to do. The second one says the diagram shows 4 specialized cells. Which of the cells undergo contraction and relaxation? So they want us to say which one undergoes contraction and relaxation. So there's a root hair cell, there's a sperm cell, a neuron. Specifically, this should be a sensory and a muscle cell. So it's a muscle cell that is able to contract and relax to bring about movement. Then 3 says that the diagram shows 2 plant cells, X and Y. So X and Y. What method of movement will make sorts to move from X to Y? So for sorts to move from X to Y, then that is supposed to be active transport because it actually requires energy. It's like you're moving from a region where you are in a lower concentration to a region where you are in a higher concentration because you're moving up in this case. So active transport will be required. Number 4, if you look at number 4, it says according to the lock and key hypothesis, which is the lock and which is the key for the enzyme maltase. So remember the enzyme maltase, they are talking about which one is the key and which one is the lock. So remember the enzyme maltase actually works on a food substrate we are calling as being maltose, and the lock in this case is simply the enzyme maltase that acts on maltose. So that was the correct answer. Some of the nutrients in sweet potatoes are listed below. So calcium, dietary fiber, iron, vitamin C. From the list, which nutrient will help to prevent which name disease in the table? So they talked about from the list anemia, of course that's iron, so it's 3. Rickets, that should be calcium. Then scurvy, that should be vitamin C. So the best option there should have been B. Nitrate ions are important in plants in the formation of what? So nitrate ions are important because they help in the formation of amino acid. The diagram shows part of a transverse section through a leaf. So this is a leaf. Remember, this is representing the vascular bundles consisting of the xylem and the phloem. Then this one here is the palisade mesophyll cell. Then that is representing the spongy mesophyll layer again, and there are spaces there. What are the main functions of the labeled region? So region 1, this helps in transporting water. Usually water and manufactured food is going to be there, so that is for transport. Then 2, when we look at these guys, there's actually gaseous exchange that usually takes place here. The gases will diffuse from the spaces that are there out of the leaf, then photosynthesis will take place. So C was actually the best option there. Then if you look at the question there, it says the diagram shows the rhizopass. Which of the labeled pass is the rhizode? So remember, B is the spore. That is the sporangium, because you'll be told to name in the exam. Then this is what we call C is the that is the sporangiophore. So that is the sporangiophore, and D is representing the rhizodes, and A is representing the stolon. So which one is labeled part is the rhizode? So D is actually the correct answer there. Which of the following is the correct dental formula of a dog? So remember, a dog has 42, so has got a total number of 42 teeth. So half of 42 is simply 21. So you simply look at which one among these is actually, 21. That C is actually the correct one. 3 plus 3, that's 6, 7, 8. 8 plus 8, that's 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. So this has actually 21 in it, because for a dog, it has actually that. So you can try out the other ones. You find that that would be the correct option. 10, it says the diagram shows the human digestive system. Yeah, what is that representing? Possibly, yeah, it's back of the mouth, the larynx, but this whole section is what we call as being the also, that is the esophagus. Then 2 is representing the stomach. 3 is representing the small intestine. Specifically, we can say the ileum, but that is the small intestines. And 4 is simply the anus. Closer to the anus, there's actually a part called the rectum. So you should remember that. And this is, the large intestine, or the large colon in this case. That's what. So where do absorption and egestion takes place? So remember, absorption is where the end product of digestion going to the blood. Then egestion is simply the removal of waste products. So absorption takes place in 3, the ileum, and egestion takes place in the anus. So C was the best option there. 11 says the diagram shows chemical digestion of a nutrient in the human body. So if that nutrient is being broken down, you can see when it attached, it simply means that this is an enzyme, because at the end of it, an enzyme do not change. And all these are what we are calling as being products that you are going to have. Right? So identify enzyme K and the product B and C. Well, under digestion, when we talk about fats, when fats are broken down, they produce what we call fatty acids. Then they also produce what we call as being glycerol. So fatty acids in this case would actually entail, when we talk about fatty acids and also glycerol. So which one they actually represent that? So what enzyme works on fats? It is simply the enzyme called lipase. So that is what you need to remember. Now when you talk about glycerol, B would have actually been glycerol, because it's one. Then fatty acids are many, and these are the one. No wonder we call them as being fatty acids. So B would have actually been the correct option. Which of the following equations shows the type of respiration that can cause an oxygen debt in muscles during vigorous exercise? So when you're carrying out vigorous exercise, you carry out anaerobic respiration, and in humans, anaerobic respiration actually produces lactic acid and energy. When glucose combines with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide, water, and energy, this actually takes place. For this to take place, this is what we call as being aerobic. Then where alcohol, carbon dioxide is actually produced, is a type of anaerobic respiration, but this actually is what we call as being, alcoholic. Sometimes we call it as being alcoholic fermentation. And alcoholic fermentation takes place in yeast when you're baking, or in plants. It is basically, but the option in the muscles, because they said in the muscles, lactic acid when there's a little oxygen that is available. Which microorganism causes cholera, and what is its mode of transmission, I mean? So what causes, in other words, what is a causative agent? In this case, it's a bacterium, and the mode of transmission is simply through contaminated water. 4, when babies are born, they have some passive immunity. Which conditions are needed for passive immunity to develop? So for passive immunity to develop, the antibodies produced by the mother have actually crossed the placenta. That's what it means. Then the child will be able to acquire, passive immunity from, the mother. All right. So we can move on to 15, so that you are able to see how you would have actually gone about that. says the setup in the diagram shows an instrument used to measure the rate of a process in plants. Of course, transpiration is actually, now this is what we call, the whole apparatus is called as being a potometer, and it measures the rate of transpiration. The following diagram shows a human heart. Which blood vessel is a vein carrying oxygenated blood? So which one is a vein carrying oxygenated blood? Remember, oxygenated blood is this side called the left, and that is the right. So which one is actually a vein that is actually carrying oxygenated blood? So the vein here, because it's actually coming from what we call as being the pulmonary, that is the pulmonary vein, the only vein that carries oxygenated blood, because all other veins carry carbon dioxide. I hope you are able to pick up that. 17 says the diagram shows the human circulatory system. At which point is the pressure of the blood circulating through the blood vessel the highest? So which point is the blood circulating the highest? So because the left hand side carries blood, especially the left ventricle pumps blood at a very high pressure. So you expect that to be found at B, because this side carries oxygenated blood and other nutrients needed by the cells of the body. So the left hand side in particular, the left ventricle pumps blood at a high pressure. No wonder it is actually thicker this side, so you should be able to remember such concept there. Then 18 says, which of the following excretory organs excretes toxins, hormones, and drugs? Obviously not the kidney. We know the kidney does actually urea, then there's excess salt and excess water. The lungs, carbon dioxide. The skin, yes, a bit of some urea, and other sweat nutrients like mineral ions. But the liver does most of that: toxins, hormones, and drugs. So the liver is actually going to to do all that. So the best option 18 was simply B there. Then the graph shows the body temperature of a person measured over a period of time. So you can see, here it is slightly between, that is 37.5. It goes slightly higher, then there it comes down below that, then maintained again. Which stages represent vasodilation and vasoconstriction? So remember, vasodilation, that to dilate means to become wider. Then constrict, vasoconstrict is to become narrower. So which stage actually there are we talking about? So vasoconstriction, the widening will happen at 4 in this case. Yeah, so it will happen basically at 4. Then dilation in this case, which is simply the widening, will happen at 2, because the temperature is too high, so you need to bring it back to normal. So it will become wider so that you lose more heat. But of course, when you lose, you need to raise it, so at 2 and 4. That's basically what is going to happen. The following diagram shows the position of the endocrine glands in the human body. So remember, in the brain, you have that endocrine gland called the pituitary gland. Then around the neck, you have got what we call as being the thyroid gland, which produces a hormone called thyroxine. Then on top of the kidney, you have what we call as being the adrenal gland, and that adrenal gland produces a hormone called adrenaline. That's what you need to remember. Then you have what we call the pancreas, which produces a hormone called insulin, and sometimes glucagon, to actually change or maintain the level of glucose in the body. Then that is representing the ovary, if it is actually in females, and that is representing the testes, if that is in a male. But collectively, they are simply called as being gonads, so you need to remember that. What is the hormone produced by the gland labeled Q? So it is thyroxine. You are able to see that. Hopefully That is basically helping you to have a quick revision and what you needed to do in this exam. Right, so if you look at that, it says which of the labeled structures in the diagram is an effector. So an effector carries out a response to a nervous impulse, and D is actually, so effectors can either be muscles or they can simply be glands. Yeah, so that is representing the spinal cord. Remember, this is somehow like, there are receptors in there, and that is representing the gray matter there, so you should remember that. The diagram shows the ear ossicles as arranged from the eardrum to the oval window. So this is what they tell us. Identify the bones Y1, 2, and 3. So usually if this is the eardrum, I love to remember them in this order. I say miss. In this case, there's what we call the malleus. So the malleus, then I is the incus, and you have the steer, the stirrup, or what we can simply call as being the steps. So basically B was actually the correct option. So this is the malleus, that's the incus, and that is the steps. So that is what you need to remember. Which of the following organisms has an exoskeleton? So outside, no doubt about it, a grasshopper has an exoskeleton. The following diagram shows a response to stimuli by, ants. So you can see the ants where it is dark, it's like they are running where it is actually dark. Yeah, what term best describes the type of response? So when it comes to animals, these are what we call invertebrates. This is simply called as being negative phototaxic because they are moving away from light, as the arrow here actually indicates. So taxic happens in invertebrates, so you need to know that. 25, it says the diagram shows the longitudinal section through a shoot apex. Which labeled part shows a region of cell division? So A is actually cell division happening in the tips of roots and shoots, so the topmost part should be the correct one. The following setup is an experiment to show that oxygen is necessary for germination. So they give you this setup, then they tell you what is the purpose of alkaline pyrogallo in Y. So what does it do? Well, this guy is the same as actually absorbing. It actually helps to absorb, oxygen gas. That's what you need to remember. So it's alkaline. Yeah, so it says 27, which of the following is the reproductive structure of Irish potatoes? Irish potatoes grow from what we call as being, tubers. So basically, it's actually an Irish potato is a tuber. In this case, a stem tuber, we can say. The diagram shows part of a flower. Which labeled part confirms the flower is insect pollinated? So what tells us that it is it's actually the presence of petals. All insect pollinated flowers consist of what we are calling as being petals. B is the stigma, and A is representing the anther. D is representing the ovule contained in the ovary there. So that's what you need to remember. 29, in which of the following parts does fertilization take place in a flower? So where fertilization takes place in the ovary contained in the ovule. So that's what you needed to remember there. 30, the diagram shows a timeline of a woman's menstrual cycle which lasts for 28 days. So remember, on which days of the menstrual cycle is the woman most likely to ovulate? So the high possibility is simply on day 14 when ovulation takes place. So there, which one? It is actually between 13 and 16. So that's what you needed to do. The diagram shows a developing fetus in the uterus. What is the name of liquid X? Please watch out my other video. You'll be able to see that's what we call as being the amniotic fluid. The diagram shows a cell during a mitosis. So they are pulling away and away because they are moving away from the center. That's called anaphase. Watch out my other video. You'll be able to see why they are saying that that is the case. Then which of the following best describe tubal ligation? So tubal ligation happens in females, and it actually involves, having oviducts cut or tight. Blood groups have the following alleles A, B, O, where A and B are dominant to O, or to dominant while O is recessive. How many different genotypes and phenotypes are possible? So for the AB blood groups, we have actually 4 possible phenotypes, but we have 6 possible types of genotypes. So that is what we have there. All right. Okay, the diagram shows an arthropod. Using the following classification key, identify the correct options for each key which identifies the arthropod. Yeah, so you just need to use key by looking at the diagram there, and I want to show you